So the Intolerable Acts are the response that the that Parliament, the King, have to the destruction of tea at the Boston Tea Party in 1773. And so these acts go into effect in 1774. The British call them the Coercive Acts. In the colonies, they were generally known as the Intolerable Acts. And I really see this as the last straw. As we said in the last video, the Tea Party was really an escalation, destruction of hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of tea destroyed. That leads to a severe response by the British, known as the Intolerable Acts. And this is kind of the last step here. We'll see on this next slide. So there's been ever increasing escalation. If you think of this idea of these acts just kind of piling up on a pivot, and eventually it's going to outweigh, and revolution is going to come, and these laws, these taxes are coming, and they, each one, as they pile up, it gets closer to kind of unleashing revolution. And you can kind of, with the addition of the Intolerable Acts, it's just too much, and revolution is in the air. Now revolution doesn't happen yet. There's still a few more steps that have to be taken before to that point. But at this point, with the passage of the Intolerable Acts, instead of things getting better, revolution is much more likely. And so the Intolerable Acts are just a continuation of escalation. The Tea Act, and then the Boston Tea Party, that the Tea Party was the colonial response, that was an escalation of events. And here, the British don't back down, they escalate as well. And so how do they escalate it? What's the big deal? What's up with these Intolerable Acts? Why are they so intolerable? Well, we'll see. So the Intolerable Acts, there's 4 acts: the Boston Port Act, the Massachusetts Government Act, the Administration of Justice Act, and the Quartering Act. This is a new quartering act. So the Boston Port Act, and the first 3 are kind of the most significant ones. So the Boston Port Act basically closes the port of Boston until the people have paid back the East India Company for all that they lost through this tea being destroyed. The Massachusetts Government Act says, well, because of what you've done, the town meetings are forbidden without consent of the governor. At least you can't have more than one a year. Previously elected positions, colonial assemblies, you've been disbanded. Other elected positions will now be selected by the governor. And when you say selected by the governor, you have to understand, the governor is appointed by the king. And so it is basically saying that the king gets to pick these positions, because the governor is not going to pick somebody that the king doesn't approve. And so all these elected positions are no longer elected, and it's now selected basically by the king. And so this is very much against what the colonists want. The idea that they don't have even representation in their own colony anymore is a serious blow. Other colonies start to see this Massachusetts Government Act in particular, and they say, wait, if he can do that there, if the king and Parliament can do that in Massachusetts, what's to stop them from doing it in these other colonies as well? There's the Administration of Justice Act. Royal officials couldn't be tried in Britain instead of the colonies if the governor says, you know what, these officials won't get a fair trial in the colonies. And of course, this is kind of a slap into the face, especially to somebody like John Adams, who defended the soldiers of the Boston Massacre. And here now, it appeared to a lot of people, hey, they got a fair trial in Boston, even where they killed people, and there was a lot of outrage over that. But they still were, many were found, not guilty of any crime, and then those that were, it was manslaughter instead of murder. And so this is definitely a big deal. George Washington called it the Murder Act. In other words, you could get away with, a British official could basically get away with murder now, because they, just be tried back in Britain, and they wouldn't, there wouldn't be any way to convict them, because the thing is, the witnesses would have to go all the way to Britain. And so that's very expensive. And even though the government said they would pay for that trip, that doesn't mean they would pay the lost wages and the time spent away from your farm and all these other things. And so this was also a big one. The Quartering Act, really the least offensive of these. It's really just taking it a step further than before. So before, colonial assemblies were supposed to pay for providing housing for troops and the food and drink and things like that, candles and things of that nature. Well, that's all the same. But if colonial assemblies did not take action to provide for the troops, then the governor could. And it's still really not in private homes, although there's a little bit of controversy over that. This is the Quartering Act, where a lot of people will say, well, now the governor can say, hey, you go live in their house or that house. But there's a lot of evidence that that's not really the case. And so this was just taking the power from the colonial assemblies to the governor and saying, the governor can then find housing for them that is not in buildings and out buildings and things like that. They're not being used. Wouldn't necessarily be in private homes still, though. So these 4 acts, really disturbed the people in Massachusetts and really the rest of the colonies as well. In Boston and Massachusetts, one of the main complaints they have is simply, hey, you're punishing the entire town, the entire colony with these laws, and not the offenders. There's somewhere between probably 50 and 130 people that committed these crimes, yet you're punishing the entire colony. None of us have representation now. The ports are completely closed off now, and people are suffering. This is our livelihood. This is the way we make money, and you're simply punishing everybody, not just those that are guilty. Now, of course, they didn't know who was guilty, but that's not the point. To the colonists, it doesn't matter. It's your job to figure out who's guilty and punish those, not the entire group. So that's one of the big issues they have. But then just in general, it's a serious escalation of tension, as we talked about before, between the colonies and Parliament. Those that are more moderate can't really defend Parliament. They can't really say, well, that what they're doing is okay. The Parliament has kind of taken it a step across the line that even many moderates are going to have a difficult time defending. Now, there are many loyalists still, those that are very loyal to the king and Parliament and feel like the colonists have taken it too far. But the more moderates, that were kind of trying to keep the peace and keep things from getting out of hand, that it's hard. It's going to be very hard for them. And then the other thing is they've gained the sympathy of otherwise less interested colonies in all these issues. Many of the southern colonies haven't been terribly interested. Virginia has been, but some of the South Carolina and some of these other colonies, they're just not as interested in what's going on. Some of the middle colonies that may not have been. It's not that they don't care about these issues, but they just haven't been at the forefront. Now, all of a sudden, with this Boston Port Act and these other laws being passed, they feel like, hey, what's going to stop Britain from doing that to us? And if they can do it to Massachusetts and Boston, then they can do it to us. And so all of a sudden, they've gained a lot of sympathy where before they didn't have that sympathy. And so one of the big things that happens as a response to this is there's a call for the Continental Congress. It turns out to be the first Continental Congress. And so at this time, 12 of the 13 colonies are going to get together. And we'll talk more about the first Continental Congress in the next video. But so the Intolerable Acts, a response to the Tea Act, and it's a big escalation of a response to the Tea Party that was a response to the Tea Act. And so this is a major escalation of tension between the colonies. And so just to kind of remember and reiterate, after the Intolerable Acts are passed, this idea that things are moving very rapidly towards the possibility of revolution. And it's definitely a serious escalation of problems, and things will not get better. Things are going to get worse before anything gets better.